Hello everyone, it's Suzanne Filiatro from the ICA, and I'm delighted to be introducing you to the start of this webinar, Persuasive Writing for New Business. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our two webinar presenters today, Jody Sutter, who's a veteran new business executive and principal of Sutter Communication, and Ashley Milne-Tyte, who's an experienced journalist. I'm going to ask whoever just logged in right now to please mute your mic, as we are getting a lot of feedback from the person that just joined us. So would you please kindly mute your mic? And I would now like to introduce you to Jody and Ashley.
That's pretty good.
Hi everybody. This is Jody Sutter. I just also, before we make the introductions and we get started with the presentation, I know that we can see your questions in a chat window if you have questions. I think that we're probably going to try to address all questions at the end, unless there's a circumstance where the question is so key to the presentation or the information we're presenting. So bear with us. We'll try to get to all your questions at the end. As Suzanne said, I'm Jody Sutter. I own a consulting company called the Sutter Company. We work with advertising agencies and other marketing services firms to help them take a more proactive and strategic approach to new business. Often what I do with my clients is help them write better proposals. And after many years, both on my own and as a consultant and working with agencies, after so many years of seeing agencies struggle to communicate persuasively, I decided to take some proactive steps myself and start this workshop, and I partnered with Ashley Milne-Tyte, who I've worked with before, but I'll have her introduce you and tell you a little bit about how we got to develop this workshop.
Hi, so I'm Ashley, and yes, Jody and I met late 90s when we were both working at RGA here in New York, and I subsequently became a journalist. I was a copywriter at RGA. That was my last job there, but I was lured into journalism, and I've mainly worked in public radio. I've done plenty of print, but my real career has been as a radio journalist, and I teach radio storytelling skills and writing at Columbia Journalism School. And actually last year I also taught a writing class at an ad agency here in New York, and I gave the class some homework. It was every week they had to do a piece of homework, and there was a particular assignment where I'd essentially asked them to rewrite something. I can't remember, it was probably a case study where they were supposed to present information about a particular client's success in an engaging way, a sort of storytelling way, something that was fun to read. And if you look at this next slide, this was one of the sentences that arrived in a piece of homework from one of the students. And the reason we've picked it out here is this is exactly the kind of sentence we're hoping to see less of. This was definitely not fun for me to read. In fact, I had to think about what it was that this young woman was actually trying to say with this sentence. It's not even a particularly long sentence, but it's so dense with jargon that I tossed it to Jody, a fully paid up member of the advertising community, and I begged her to turn it into plain English. And you're going to see the results of her efforts a bit later in the presentation.
Yeah, she laid down that challenge for me. And I wish I could say that this is an aberration, but I see sentences like this way too often in agency RFP responses. Here's what else I see. I see a lot of jargon. And I think the main reason why advertising agencies tend to rely on jargon is that they are words that give the impression that they communicate a lot, that they communicate effectively, when in fact they actually communicate very little at all. Sometimes they communicate nothing at all. So I advocate to start to remove the jargon from your conversation, from your writing, from your RFP responses. But I understand, though. I understand why you use it. It takes less time, but the problem is that it usually results in a substandard response. One of the things that jargon does not do is it doesn't communicate your value to the prospect. In fact, it's even a little disrespectful, because using jargon, which tend to be opaque and meaningless words, you're actually asking your reader to do a lot of extra work to decipher what you've just written. So instead, my advice is to give yourself a competitive advantage through good writing. Now, back in the 70s, and this probably dates me a little bit, but back in the 70s, Steve Martin had a really funny line in one of his stand-up routines. And so this is with apologies to Steve Martin, because I don't deliver it in quite the same way. But he said, some people have a way with words, and other people, not have way, I guess. But I think Steve Martin was wrong, because good writing can be learned, and we're going to get you going with some basics that'll help you improve your writing right away. So today we have an hour with you, maybe a little less than an hour with you, and we're going to cover some topics that, as I said, are going to help you improve your writing right away. Now, this is a much abbreviated version of a workshop that we do, a half-day workshop at advertising agencies. So if you feel like when you're finished with this webinar that we've touched on some things that might be bigger problems for you, and you'd like to get back in touch with us about potentially doing a workshop with your agency, we'll make sure you know how to reach us, and we'd love to talk to you about it. But today we're going to take you through some easy techniques. We're going to talk about how clarity and simplification helps you say more with less. And then if we have time, we're going to talk to you a little bit about how to infuse your RFP responses with creativity and what that means. So one of my theories as to why it's difficult for advertising agencies to write RFP responses or write about what they do and communicate their value is because you have to describe abstract ideas and processes. Because most of advertising is abstract. It's about your insights, your ideas, it's all in your head, right? So you really want to use all the tools at your disposal to communicate that working with your agency is going to be a positive experience. Now, the good news is that these tools are easily accessible by anyone. The bad news is that they're often overlooked, but we're going to work to change that. So I'm going to have Ashley start us off with 6 best practices that will lead to more persuasive writing.
Exactly. So we're going to run through these one by one. And the first of these is, before you do anything else, pause for a minute and think about what you want to say and who you're actually saying it to. And it may seem completely obvious, of course I know what I want to say, but the meaning of something can get lost pretty quickly if your writing becomes dense, if you use convoluted sentences, lots of clauses, throw in the industry jargon. So just stop for a minute to think about what it is you want to convey, what the nub of your message is, and I would advocate writing it down before you do anything else, because this can really help you stay on track during the entire writing process, just having that sort of mission statement written in front of you.
Yeah, I think this is also the point where you can start thinking from your client's perspective. And very specifically, when it comes to answering RFP responses, start thinking about who is going to be reading this, and not only who is going to be reading this, but how they're going to be reading it. So the first thing you should do is you should go back to your RFP and take a look at the list of clients who are there. What are the roles that are represented? Sometimes there will be generalists like senior vice presidents of marketing. Other times, or maybe in the same RFP, there might be experts, like you might have a director of analytics or a head of social media. You're probably going to find a range of responsibilities as well, from very senior people like CMOs down to middle managers like an advertising manager. And of course, increasingly, you're seeing names from procurement as well. All these people are going to have different agendas, and you should account for that in your overall strategy.
So next up is the word dump. I think most people have been faced at least once with the sort of apprehension of overcoming a completely blank page. And I would say the way to start is just to start. And that means writing down anything and everything that comes into your head, no matter how unfit for consumption you might think it seems. Don't worry about grammar, don't worry about spelling. The whole point is just to get something down on the page. It's not a time to be strict with yourself and to start editing yourself. We're going to talk about that more a bit later. But just start writing, because words tend to beget more words, and if you are one of these people who starts off feeling incredibly stuck and doesn't know where to begin, you will get into a flow simply by writing.
There's, one of an author that I read, a woman named Ann Handy. She's a marketer and a writer and a writing consultant, and she has a term that I love. It's called the ugly first draft. And you know what, no matter how good or how experienced a writer you are, that first draft, your first word dump is going to be ugly. But there's some freedom in that because it means that you're the only one who has to see it. The other thing about a word dump when you're talking about advertising agencies and RFP responses is where boilerplate copy often comes back in. And usually the process is you go back to your files, you see what's already been written so that you're not reinventing the wheel, and you're being efficient, right? And I think that's a good thing to do, but what I don't see is I don't see enough customization of that boilerplate. And I think that most of us have a codependent love affair with boilerplate. Yes, it saves a lot of time, but it also can result in a lot of mediocre responses, not to mention sloppy mistakes like faulty find replaces. So again, my advice is to always customize your boilerplate copy, because rarely does it suffice as final content. And of course, that's because every client is different. They're in different business categories. They've got different marketing priorities, and your responses have to reflect that.
Right, and now we're going to move on to what hopefully is an exciting part of the presentation in that it's all about telling a story, which is really the most pleasurable part of writing, and which perhaps you don't necessarily think of business writing as being story writing, but they can be one and the same. And this is where you're turning something mundane or abstract, as Jody mentioned earlier, these abstract ideas you have in your head, but it's hard to convey them. Stories allow you to turn those into something tangible that other people can relate to. And some of you may know, have read the research on storytelling, but our brains are set up for storytelling. So there's scientific research that shows our brains are wired to understand and respond to stories in a way they're just not to, you know, a list or a set of bullet points. And basically, a story is a narrative. It's a series of linear events that lead to what is hopefully a satisfying conclusion. And, you know, as human beings, we want things to make sense. We crave coherence, and that's where stories come in. We need to impose order on our world, and storytelling is how we do it. And I always think of the huge news story last year was that Malaysian Airlines flight that went down, and we still don't really know what happened to it, but all the stories that came out about that, all the conspiracy theories about what might have happened. I mean, people do that because we desperately need to know what happened. And if we don't know what happened, we tell a story about it. And also, when people read a story or hear a story, we do something subconsciously. We seek to relate the stuff in the story to our own experience. So there's this human connection you get that, again, you don't get in a series of bullet points. So it's a great way to connect with a client. And what you're seeing here is a classic story arc. So most sort of stories and fairy tales that we grow up on, they have an arc. And I'll just quickly run you through this classic story arc. So a story generally begins with a state of stasis, so humdrum everyday reality out of which the protagonist is suddenly plucked. And it's usually there's some kind of trigger in a story, something that kicks the story into high gear. And next you get to a quest. A big part of many stories is some kind of journey to find something physical or to find something out that the main character goes on. And then there's always surprise in a good story, keeps everyone on their toes. And then you always get to a point in a story, or you usually do, where there's a critical choice that the character has to make to go on to the next point. And then there's the climax, which is the highest peak of tension in the story. And then usually by the end of a novel, say, there's what the storytelling experts call reversal. So the main character has changed in some way, something has happened and they're moving on in life in some kind of a different state. And then finally, resolution, which is when everything is hopefully tied up and ends on a satisfying note. And just to go into a little bit more detail on stories, we picked a story that we figured virtually everybody would be familiar with, which is The Wizard of Oz. And for any literature fans out there, I would admit I have not read Frank Baum's original book, so we were purely sticking to the plot of the movie when we set this up. But if you think about Dorothy, so her sense of stasis is when she's in Kansas with her aunt and uncle, ticking along. Then the trigger to set the story off is the tornado that comes and sweeps her house up and dumps her and it in the land of Oz. And then the quest, well, in her case, it truly is a quest. She's off to find out how to get back home, and she's off down the yellow brick road. And I would say in this story there are multiple elements of surprise. I mean, she meets, the lion and the tin man and the scarecrow, but there's also all sorts of havoc that comes through the witch that ends up happening in that story. And then the critical choice for Dorothy is when she ends up in the land of Oz. She finally meets the wizard, and he says, well, I will only help you if you defeat the Wicked Witch of the West. So that was her critical choice, that she decided that she would do that before going back to Oz. So, and the climax of this story, so we debated about this a little bit, but we concluded that it was the point in the story where Dorothy throws a bucket of water over, I think it was the scarecrow, to save him from burning up, but the witch gets hit by it and she melts. So we thought that was the highest peak of tension in the Wizard of Oz movie. And then reversal, so towards the end of the film, if you remember, she is all set to go back to Oz, she's in the balloon, suddenly, hot air balloon, suddenly Toto jumps out, I think he's seen a cat, and she leaps out to go after him because she won't leave her dog behind. So she thinks, oh no, I've missed my chance to go back home, everything's doom and gloom. And then the good witch actually reminds her, you know what, you've always had the power to get home yourself. And Dorothy realizes, oh yes, I've always had the power, I just need to click my shoes. That's her reversal, that's her realization that something has really changed and she can do this. And resolution, of course, is when she ends up back home with everyone smiling around her bed.
So we see stories every day in our lives, and I think you can take a lot of the content that you write for RFPs and turn it into a story, or better phrased, to take elements of the classic story arc and use them in your content. And of course, as Ashley said, that this story arc is classic, it's academic, and you should really use it as a guide, not necessarily a checklist, because the stories you tell may not have all of these elements, but they might have a lot of them. Now, I think one of the things that lends itself particularly well to the story arc is an agency case study, because by its nature it has the starts with the stasis, which is the current situation, or what had been the current situation until that trigger came along. The challenge, whether that's your client's new competitor or whether it's a declining economy which is affecting your client's sales or revenue. Then you might go on a quest with that client, and that's potentially that's your research, your research process. That's your discovery of insights or development of insights. It can even be your creative development. It can even be a story about your execution, especially if the execution of that campaign, getting that campaign into the marketplace, involves something particularly difficult or challenging, like a campaign on a massive scale, or potentially you're using some sort of new technology that's a little bit risky or difficult. Your campaign launch is typically the climactic moment, but sometimes also there's a bit of reversal. I've seen that campaigns launch and they do pretty well, but maybe not as well as expected. And now we have the tools at our hands to be able to optimize a lot of campaigns and relaunch them. And so that's a little bit of a reversal before a final happy ending. And I think that also makes the story a little bit human and something that clients can relate to. You can take this also and apply it to lots of other things, maybe not as clearly, but you can use elements of a story arc in your team bios, in your agency history, in your agency's mission. Even story elements can be incorporated into questions about your strategic approach to an assignment. So start by playing around maybe with case studies, and then see if you can explore a little bit more with the different types of content that you put in your RFP responses.
Right, exactly. And so now we're going to move on to the writer's checklist to break bad habits, which is really easily applicable in your lives. And it's just a few simple rules that you can use to make your writing a lot simpler and clearer and more conversational. So the first thing I would bring up is using the active voice rather than the passive voice. And there's an example here, really simple sentence. So if you were to write this in the passive, it would say the RFP was answered by the agency. Active voice, the agency answered the RFP. The sentence is just much cleaner and conveys a sense of action that just doesn't happen when you see it in the passive. I think I see a lot of the passive voice used in business writing, and there's a real journalism rule that you don't use it because it just doesn't convey the message as clearly and actively as the active voice. But I think the reason that it's used in business writing is that somehow more formal sentences, and often the passive will turn a sentence into a longer sentence. These longer, more formal sentences are more professional, and this is just how you write in business. I think there's almost a fear among some people that if you don't write that way, people think you don't know what you're talking about. But good writing is lean and to the point, and it uses only the number of words it needs to convey the message. Also, the reason I'm really anti-passive, and I'm not saying you can never use it, of course, like the odd passive sentence in your work, it isn't going to be horrible, but using the passive voice, it lets you weasel out of ownership of your words and actions. When something was done by someone, it makes the action sound a lot less connected to the doer. And the big example I always think of this, of course, is mistakes were made. No one ever will admit to making the mistakes themselves. Not we made the mistake or the company screwed up. No, mistakes were made. So somehow nobody's name gets on that. But I really want to discourage you from writing this way because it's feeble, and your sentences will convey so much more of a punch if they're written in the active voice. So have the courage of your convictions and use that as much as you possibly can. Just a quick aside about when I was working in the agency world, even before I met Jody, I came into work one day and it was early, and on everybody's desk was a copy of this book you see here called On Writing Well, and it was by a former journalist and wonderful writing teacher called William Zinser, who actually died just very recently in the last couple of weeks in his early 90s. And there was a note pinned to it from the head of department saying, essentially, I am so sick of getting poorly written emails and reading poorly written memos. I bought you all a copy of this book. Please read it and use it in your daily writing. And I remember thinking rather snobbily, I'm English. I don't need to read this. I know how to write. So I didn't read it for months. But when I finally opened it, I loved it. I actually enjoyed reading it. And that's the thing about this book. It conveys its message in a fun, entertaining way. And it's taught me so much. And his essential message is that your writing should be brief, clear, and human, conversational. And we really want to convey that. Just because you're writing for work, you're always writing for another human being. So, and that doesn't mean using slang. It just means writing in a conversational way. So it is a wonderful book for anyone who feels like picking it up. And next up, simplify words. If you can possibly use shorter words, do. So I don't know how many people would even think of using assemblage, but it's probably cropped up in various documents. Crowd. Optimum, I see that a lot in business writing. Best is better. Disseminate, spread, initiate, start, and something I see all the time, utilize. You very rarely do we talk about utilizing things. Think about how you would, the kind of vocabulary you would use in your everyday life, and use that instead, because there's nothing to be gained by using words that have several syllables and that simply don't sound like human everyday language.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce the point. Earlier I said not to avoid jargon, and I think jargon overcomplicates sentences. It's another one of its sins. So by simplifying things, you help to make that abstract more concrete. And jargon just makes the abstract more abstract. But I want to point out a quick distinction between jargon, which is, I think, almost always bad, and argot. And sometimes there's a gray area of when argot is not always good, but especially in the way it's defined in the second definition, argot as terminology used by a particular group of people. So, for instance, if you are pitching a financial services brand and you want to show that you know the difference between a broker-dealer and a financial advisor, or the difference between trading securities on an exchange versus over-the-counter. So my point here is to speak their language. Don't drown them in your jargon.
Right. So next up, eliminate unnecessary words, get rid of them. One of the things that I try and stick to now, and that I actually learned from On Writing Well all those years ago, is to just use the words that you really need to convey your message. So if you look at this first sentence, which is pretty packed with words, our integrated strategy group is responsible for insights that are fueled by consumer data. And this was actually taken from a client document, Jody's. And then if you look at the second sentence, our strategy team uses data to uncover consumer insights. It's much more direct, to the point. It conveys a sense of action. So please just think about the words you need to convey the message and use them, and don't use any extra words. And it's something that writing teachers will often tell you, is that if in doubt, leave it out. And it is amazing what you can leave out of your writing when you go back over it. So it's just really something to think about. And then use adjectives carefully. So if you look at the first sentence, we are passionate about our client's business and relentless in pursuing results on their behalf. And those are two of Jody's least favorite jargon words in there. And then on underneath, getting results for our clients is our biggest priority. So you're not, well, I'll let Jody take it away from here, actually, because I know she has strong views.
Yeah, I have very strong opinions about this. And I will also, full disclosure, I have done this before, so I am guilty, but not anymore. It's one of the problems is, for me, is that I find that adjectives don't, well, instead of using adjectives, you should always strive for real proof. And for me, when I see adjectives like relentless and passionate being used to describe an advertising agency, a red flag goes up, and I automatically think, well, if they have to say it that way, then it's probably not true. So again, I advocate for proving it instead. And what's your proof? Well, your proof is in your case studies or in your process. You know, if you're truly relentless in getting results for your clients, then your process should reflect that. If you are truly passionate, as passionate as you might be about other things, then that's going to be reflected in how you hire and who you hire. So talk about that, and then that will show through it. It'll demonstrate what your agency is like in a much more effective and a more persuasive way than just saying you're passionate and relentless.
Right.
Oh, sorry, I forgot this wonderful slide. So also, besides banning all that jargon, I would also suggest to ban these words as well. You know, in and of themselves, these words are not bad words, but again, like passionate and relentless, they're overused, and proof is so much better than these adjectives or these words describers.
So another thing is, you know, the English language is so rich. You can always, if you seek hard enough, find the exact right word for what you're saying. And verbs do a lot of work in a sentence. But unfortunately, in business writing, it's really easy to come across weakling verbs. So you can see the examples on the left side. So gave assistance to. A, it's long and clunky. And B, you could just say helped. Gave an explanation, explained. Did the marketing for, marketed. Call your attention to. Remind. There's usually always a pithier way to say what you want to say, and we're just asking you to think a little bit more carefully about doing that. Strong verbs pack such a punch, and they really bring your writing to life. So it's worth thinking about the verb you want to use and the noun as well. And actually, you know, Jody was mentioning, sort of talking about adjectives in the context of not using adjectives in place of actual proof. And I would say, certainly in my world, in the public radio world I come from, you really have to write tight, obviously, because you may only have sort of 55 seconds to convey your message. And we're really discouraged from using adjectives at all, because the argument is, if you're choosing the exact right noun and verb to do the work of the sentence, you don't need an adjective to jazz it up. Very actually counts as an adjective or an adverb depending on the context, and very is banned from my scripts, my radio scripts, 90% of the time, because there's no need to say something is, you know, very bad when you can say it was terrible, or very annoying when you can say maddening or something else. So just think about, because these all add up to extra words that you don't necessarily need. And I also want to put in a word about adverbs here. Again, if you choose a strong verb, you do not need an adverb. So just to take one example, simple example, instead of saying, he walked slowly down the street, you could say, he ambled down the street, he wandered down the street, whatever it is, just think of something that means that you don't have to stick that extra word in there. Because, again, just these juicy verbs bring your sentences to life.
Also, if you're stumped, use a thesaurus, which is something that we use all the time, and I think most writers do.
Yes, there is no shame in using a thesaurus at all. And so finally, in this part, do edit to clarify and simplify your writing. So some of the rules we've just been describing would take place in the editing process. So say you've done a massive word dump, you've just written it all down, it's all there. You do need to go back and sort through that. I'm the sort of person that tends to write in stages. I'll write one section, I'll clean up that, I'll move on to the next, it'll be more of a word dump, I'll clean up that. Everyone has their different way of writing, but it is vital to edit your work before it reaches the client, rather than thinking, phew, I finished, off it goes. As someone who works on their own a lot, I have to do a lot of editing of myself. I sometimes still have an editor in my work, but I do edit myself, and it's vital to turning in your best product. I now actually really enjoy it because I know it's the part where I'm making the thing better. But when you are really close to something, you often can't see what's wrong with it. So what I do is take a break from the thing on the screen, come back, and then reread with what I've written with a more critical eye. You do need a break from it if it's just you doing the editing to enable you to see it properly. And I use this phrase quite a lot when I teach at Columbia. It's kill your babies or killing your babies. Some people call it killing your darlings. I do this all the time. That means favorite lines, paragraphs I've crafted with love and attention. But if you get to the end of your document and you feel it's too long and some of that description or whatever it is going to have to go, you have to be ruthless about what you get rid of, because you want the client to see your best work, and the best work is always edited.
Yeah, I think in the end, submitting an unedited document is submitting an incomplete document. And I compare it to getting all dolled up to go to a fancy party and then walking out the door with your wet hair still wrapped in a towel and the price tag still attached to your dress. I will also just make another point to what Ashley had said about taking the time to step away and then come back. And I know that that can be very hard to do when you're under a tight deadline for to finish an RFP response. But I also know from a lot of personal experiences that typically these types of things are left till the last minute. So I'd invite you to think about how a more disciplined approach could afford you that time. It's so much easier if you can, it makes it so much easier if you can divide that up instead of that stressful hour or so and finishing up or writing that question that you've been assigned to in the RFP response, to divide that up into a couple of 20-minute segments over the course of a couple of days. Also, to further talk about editing, to clarify and simplify, this is a page from William Zinser's book on writing well. And what Ashley and I both love about this, it happens early on in the book, and what he's demonstrating here is how much editing happens up until the very moment. So what you see on the top looks, to the untrained eye, it almost looks like it's a first draft coming back with a lot of changes. But in fact, this is the fourth or fifth draft, fairly close to being a final draft, and he's still making changes. He's still finding words that are unnecessary. He's still finding words that can be simpler. And again, I think it's a great illustration of not only a professional writer, but also a teacher of writing, and how much editing he does through 4 or 5 versions. So, okay, we've talked about storytelling and how to infuse that into your RFP responses and your answers. We've talked about some basic rules and tried to apply those to some chronic mistakes that we see in RFP responses. Let's put this all into practice. I'm going to show you a couple of befores and afters, and we're going to go through them, disassemble them a little bit, and see then how editing really has the potential for transforming your writing. So this first one, this is, just to give you some context, this is part of a proposal written by one of my clients. The context is that it's a late-stage proposal. Their client had essentially told them they wanted to work with this agency, but they just simply needed a better sense of what the scope of work was going to be and how the agency essentially planned to spend their money on the client's behalf. So it says, understanding that there are numerous goals for this relationship, this proposal reflects a recommendation for the first 3 months in an effort to address these initial objectives within the provided time frame. Please note that hard costs associated with photography, production, etc. have not been accounted for at this time. Now, the first thing that I see, truly the first thing, is, first red underline right under that first word, is that the thing or the person that's doing the understanding doesn't agree with the subject of the sentence. This is the kind of thing that happens all the time in an early draft or in a word dump when you are primarily concerned with getting some ideas on the page. But this is also the kind of thing that is that gets addressed in editing. Another thing about this sentence, whoops, sorry, lost my advancing. There we go. It's also a very good example of an agency that is trying so hard to express abstract ideas in a concrete way and wrap some value around them. So, but the result is that they end up being overly complicated sentences that don't really tell you anything. And then finally, I just thought this was a bit of a buzzkill at the end. Like I said, it's a late-stage proposal, so it's not that this information isn't important. In fact, this is important information because they're starting to talk about their fees and what it includes and what it doesn't. But this paragraph appeared towards the beginning of the presentation or the proposal as they were trying to draw the client into the process and get them excited about working with them. So why, why bring it down, with what you're not going to include? It's such a it's a detail that can be saved for later. So here's a potential rewrite. There's a lot to accomplish, and we can't wait to get started. Since many of the goals have yet to be defined, we suggest spending the next 3 months focused on figuring out how your brand looks, feels, and acts. This is going to give us a strong foundation that will support and even inform future marketing activities. So I've used simpler language, I've used action verbs and plain words. But even though it's simpler, I think it does a better job at communicating why this phase of work is important and why the client should pay for it and get value out of it.
And it sounds very conversational, like one human speaking to another human.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a look at the next one. And again, some context. This was part of a case study. There's a different agency, different RFP response. It was part of a case study, and the client in the RFP asked for each case study to be introduced with a paragraph that says why the case study is relevant to them. They may have had a lot of different reasons to do that, maybe because they didn't want to have to be bothered with reading a lot of case studies, or before they did, they only wanted to read the ones that they knew that were going to be good. So really this was a wonderful opportunity for the agency to pack a big punch in this paragraph, and unfortunately they just didn't do it. So they said, focusing on the power of social media, we were able to combine local targeting and campaign optimization to close the loop between brand likability and sales. The different market insights in terms of sentiment proved to be invaluable to the client and are now being used in product development and future worldwide marketing efforts. Okay. So we don't have a different disagreement between the object and who's doing the focusing, but still this phrase is awkward. Focusing on the power of social media sounds like some sort of like social media mind meld. Again, through the editing process, this is the kind of thing that would get weeded out. Combine local targeting and campaign optimization to close the loop between brand likability and sales. I think I know what you're trying to say, but it's awkward. And if you elicit that type of response in your reader, again, it sort of brings up, first you're asking them to spend too much time to try to decipher your words, and you're going to start making them feel a little resentful, and they won't continue to read. The different market insights in terms of sentiment, it's just a little, I think there are probably 2 or 3 more words that are in that section that need to be there. And then this is a great example of the words trying to take the place of proof. Show me, don't tell me. So here's my rewrite. Now, the other thing I have to tell you for some context is as I went through the case study, I saw that there was some very key information that was a bit buried. And that was that one of the most important things they did in this campaign is that they discovered 4 target customers, 4 archetypal customers that were really key to this. And so I thought, you know what, that should be in the first paragraph. That's going to entice your client to want to read more. So what I said was, we combined local targeting, campaign optimization, and the power of social media to close the loop between brand affinity and sales. Through our research, we identified 4 archetypal customers that the client continues to use in its product development and worldwide marketing efforts. So the other thing, too, that I did is the whole idea of the fact that these archetypal customers continue to be used, I think implies that they are invaluable, right? Or that they are valuable. So what I tried to do is I removed the invaluable and added some proof. Sort of let the reader decide whether it was valuable or not. So really the message is to put yourself in the reader's shoes. We've said it a few times, spend time either writing, edit, simplify, clarify. Remember, the people who are going to be reading your submission might be reading dozens of others. And I just think that there is an enormous opportunity for advertising agencies to differentiate themselves through smart, concise, and persuasive writing. And you only get there by editing your work. Right. In fact, you may even find you spend more time editing than quote-unquote writing, and that is normal.
Exactly.
So let's take a look at the sentence that Ashley challenged me with at the beginning. Yeah, remember this? Now, one of the things that I would have done, if this were a real situation and I was the new business director who got this beauty in my inbox, is I would have gone back to the original writer and I would have asked for more context. I didn't have that luxury, so I invented one. I took a lot of liberties. I invented a context of a campaign that was targeted towards new moms. So here's my rewrite. We also bought display ads across sites like babycenter.com and scarymommy.com, which, by the way, is a real site. Popular destinations for new moms under 30. Our goal was a cost per acquisition of $1 for each new customer. So you can see I cleared away the dense language like endemic and behaviorally targeted, and I substituted some specificity. I said things like, I said, here are the places where we bought media. You're going to find a ton of new moms in these places. And saying it this way actually gives the reader a glimpse into just your decision making, as opposed to taking them down through a rabbit hole of process. Now, interestingly, I also made it longer. Usually it's about making things shorter. But I made it longer, turning it into 2 sentences. And that was because the original sentence was so dense. It was like a black star or black hole of sentences that I thought it deserved to be unpacked and turned into 2. Okay, so we've taken you through some basics, talked about storytelling, showed you how to connect with the reader, talked about rules, showed you how those rules can be applied. But we have one last practice on our 6 best practices for writing, and it is really important, and that is proofreading. I'm going to turn it over back to Ashley.
Right. So again, last thing you want to do at the end of producing a document probably is go over it, spotting for errors, but it can end up being really embarrassing if an error is discovered by a client that actually stops you getting the business. So just first off, and I have talked about this earlier, I know time is of the essence, but if you can possibly step away from a while so you can come back to what you're looking at with a clearer eye and brain, that would be great. There are all sorts of different ways in which you can proofread if you are going to do this. So one sort of expert proofreader told me that it's a good idea to read through the text a few times, spotting something different every time. So one time you could go through spotting for spelling and punctuation. Another time you or somebody else could go through looking at, word choice. Is that really what we want to say there? Or for sentence structure. So I know that requires time, but it's a tried and true method taught to me by a really good proofreader. The third point is check the accuracy of names. This is something so easily done before you hand the document in, but sometimes really silly mistakes are made, even a client's name being misspelled or the name of a key person on the team. So please check what is easy for you to check before the document is seen by the client, because it would be really horrible if something as tiny and silly as a one letter wrong in a name were to trip you up. Then, and I find this all the time with my work, if you can possibly look at a hard copy, you will spot things that you don't spot when you're looking at a screen. I don't know what, it's something about the way our brain processes information, but when I print out a script or a piece, I spot things that I do not spot when I've been staring at that thing on my screen for hours on end. We said earlier that before we get to that, if you can, or if you can have someone else do it, read the text out loud. Again, you will spot glitches, errors, things that don't sound quite right when you're reading it aloud. So that's another tip there. And then no shame in using thesaurus, and there is certainly no shame in using spell check. Of course, we've all been tripped up by using spell check, and it picks a word, it misses things because the word is perfectly valid. It's not meant to be, it's just not the word we meant to use. So you do need to use your eyes as well, and it's worth using a dictionary, but it is still worth using spell check. And finally, this is from a copy editor at the New York Times: read the text backwards. Again, this requires having a little bit of time, but this is another thing. It tricks your brain. When you're reading the text not in the flow that you're used to, you're just checking for words starting at the bottom, you will come across errors that you would never spot otherwise. So those are just some tips for proofreading.
Yeah, I've got one final tip. Hire a proofreader. If you really feel like you don't have the time and or don't have the ability, let's say that you're the only one working on this document, hire a proofreader. It's not terribly expensive, and you can often find them ones that work around the clock. They'll work crazy shifts. So if you are burning the midnight oil to finish this up, you might be able to get a proofreader to take a look, between midnight and 6 a.m. And also, just to go back to what Ashley was saying about one little mistake that can turn a beautiful proposal into something that doesn't get considered. When we were putting together the material for the webinar and the workshop, I talked to several agency search consultants that I'm good friends with. And first of all, I thought this was a great idea and much needed, but they also brought up, two of them brought up two separate situations where an agency did not advance because they misspelled the client's name. And in one of those cases, the search consultant went to bat for the agency because she knew that the proposal was good and the agency would be a great fit. But it didn't cut it. The client just at that point said, nope, not going to do it. If they can't bother to try to get our name right, then why am I going to trust them with my business? So I think we do have a couple of minutes before we get to questions, and I do see a couple of questions in here, just to talk about creativity. I think a lot of agencies stew over how to outdo their competitors, using bells and whistles and how to use fancy packaging, clever presentation, different gimmicks. And now I'm not advocating that you leave it to the competition to charm and delight the client, but I do recommend that you approach this in the right way. So I thought I'd just share a few do's and don'ts. What I think creativity can't fix, first and foremost, are typos, and I'm not going to belabor this point. Just remember, it could be the difference between rejection and getting to the next round. Creativity is not going to fix an unanswered brief. Like typos, this is a pretty easy thing to control. Make sure that you're reading and rereading the questions correctly and answering them thoroughly. And if you don't understand what the question is asking, because clients are not necessarily any better at being clear through the written word, then ask them. Creativity is not going to fix dense copy that's impossible to read. No amount of flashy presentation can make up for that. It won't fix obsequious use of the client's brand, and I see this a lot, I'm always puzzled by it. A lot of times people will plaster their presentation or their proposal with the client's brand imagery. And I think the intention is to show how much you get the brand. But if you think about it, some other agency is probably responsible for that work, potentially the other agency that you're competing against in this business. So why would you want to show another agency's work? You don't. And it doesn't tell the client anything about you either. Creativity also won't fix, the final point here, formats that are difficult to distribute, read, and store. Don't invest in a beautiful package if you know or you have a hunch that this presentation is going to be chopped up and redistributed to different readers. I think many a beautiful presentation has never made it past the executive assistant's desk. It's another reason why your writing, by the way, has to work especially hard. Also, don't put it in formats that are difficult to read. And, some people still like to read hard copies. So when you are designing your response, make sure it can be easily printed, easily put into a normal size file folder or into a normal size briefcase. Now, smart ways to be creative. First of all, be strategic and not gratuitous. If you're doing something attention grabbing, make sure it's within the context of your client. Something else, give something of value, and I'm not implying any kind of financial value, no bribes allowed, but you're probably going to start trying to get smart on the client anyway. So if you're going to do a little research, maybe some proprietary research, or if you're developing some new insights, then maybe share that, flesh that out a bit and share that with a client. It'll demonstrate your enthusiasm and it'll give them something of value. Consider formats that are going to enhance the response. And that might be a microsite with more information about your work, maybe video interviews with your team members so that your client or your prospect starts to get to know you and your personality before they meet you. They'll be more likely, hopefully, to want to meet you. The final thing is if you've got a great idea, it's within the context of the client's challenges and you have the time to do it, then get the right people involved. And sometimes the person who's running the RFP process is not necessarily the right person because that person is responsible for pulling in the content, for chasing down team members, for rewriting and editing, for formatting. So make sure you have the right people involved, people who have the bandwidth to do it. And then also get the right designers or production artists or copywriters or people with the right technical skills and give them a brief, give them a timeline and a review process. Give them adequate time for approvals and reviews. First of all, I want to thank you guys so much for spending the time with us. We do have some time for questions. And there was the first question that came across was from Keely at ThinkShift, and she asked, how might you allocate time for writing and editing an RFP response, since realistically you guys are typically under tight deadlines. So as I said before, it's a tough question, but what we advocate is that if you know that, if you start writing an answer at 9 p.m. the night before it's due, and I know, look, we've all been there, right? But let's say it's going to take you 3 hours. You're going to write it from 9 p.m. until midnight. Hopefully you're putting it in the document or hitting send to the person that's compiling it. Probably what you've just done is you spent 3 really inefficient hours writing something that is going to be, that's going to be suboptimal. So instead, sort of think again. You have to start rethinking your discipline. Rather than starting at 9 p.m. and working till midnight, maybe start at 8 p.m. 2 days earlier and work until 9, and do that for the next 2 days. So that on day 1 you're doing your word dump. On day 2 you're doing your second revision. On day 3 you're going back to it and polishing it. I think that rarely do clients give people, especially if it's a major response, rarely do they give them any less than 3 days, and usually it's more like a week, and sometimes it's 2 weeks. So you're going to have to squeeze in the work anyway. Just try to distribute it a little bit more evenly. That would be my biggest suggestion. Any other questions? Let's see. Okay. Gardenia has come up with a question about other resources. We talked about William Zinsser. He is a great resource. Some other ones that we would recommend, well, a couple of ones that are classic texts are Strunk and White, as well as the Chicago Manual of Style, and those are real nuts and bolts. When you should use the semicolon.
Yeah.
But fantastic things to have on your desk.
And then there's one actually that I've bought recently that I heard about on a writing podcast called How to Write Anything. And we've both been reading that recently, and I think we're agreed that we both like it. And this covers not just business writing, but any type of writing. But it covers quite a bit actually about business email and even IM and stuff like that. It's about how to communicate well. I really recommend that actually.
Yeah, it's a great one. It's by Laura Brown, also a Columbia professor.
Right.
I kind of feel like it's kind of like a cookbook. It's another great thing to have on your desk. A couple of other things, if you are a bit of a language file, there's a great book by Bill Bryson called Mother Tongue, and that talks about the origins of the English language, and so it'll sort of help to maybe give you a deeper perspective on why you use the words that you do. And I'll just give you one other quick thing, and be happy also, Gardenia too, to put this into an email for you to distribute to everyone. There's a website called the Hemingway app, www.hemingwayapp.com, so Hemingway like the writer, and you can plug content in there, and it'll come back and tell you, it'll point out the different flaws, like how many uses of the passive verb you have in that paragraph, and again, other sins. It's kind of a fun thing.
Yeah.
So, anything else? I think we only have a couple of minutes left anyway, though. Here's one other quick question. What if you can't get clients to give results in case studies? Another really difficult situation, I know, and my best answer would be to start to incorporate the question before you even launch the campaign. I think agencies, we tend to want to, we're service organizations, so we tend to want to bend over backwards for the client and do what they want. But you start to lose leverage once you do things like you get a contract signed, or once you start to develop creative work for the client, or release that work into the marketplace. But before you start a campaign, or even better, before you sign the contract with a client, have it written within the contract that you need to have some form of results for your case studies, so that you can thrive as an agency just as they expect to be able to thrive as a marketer. And again, at the beginning of a campaign, train your account directors to not only ask, but to prepare the client that you will be looking for some kind of results. And sometimes it's a negotiation. Maybe you can't have some results, but maybe there are others that are going to be equally as valid. Do you have any tips on following up on RFPs? Well, I think it depends on the situation. If you are part of a very controlled situation, very controlled process with a search consultant who's managing the flow, and I think this is what you're asking, following up with a client. And if it's not the case, then type again so I can refine my answer. But I would never be afraid to not engage the consultant, because they are there for you as much as they are there for the client. At least the ones that I know would say that. So if you're not getting the feedback you need, push the consultant a little bit. If you are working directly with the client, then I think that you have every right to make sure that you're following up in a way that's reasonable. So you don't necessarily want to follow up within the first 24 hours. But, well, here's the other thing, too, is at the beginning of the process, if they don't give you a timeline for how they are going to be reviewing the document, then I think you are within your rights to ask for that. And then make sure that you're sticking to that. So if they're telling you they need a week to review it because they've got a dozen people reading it and half of them are spread around the world, then, give them that week. And I also would not be afraid to ask them for detailed feedback, especially if for some reason you don't make it to the next round of the review. And again, that can be tough, and people don't want to hurt other people's feelings. But I would push for specific feedback. It's going to help you. Hopefully that answered the question. Oh, and he's typing a message. We'll find out. Yes, perfect. Thanks. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. I think we're probably out of time for all you guys, and I appreciate you spending the lunch hour with us.
Exactly.
And, if you do have other follow-up questions, or you would like to talk to us about potentially doing a workshop at your agency, you can reach me at this email, this phone number, jody@thesuttercompany.com, and, of course, Suzanne knows how to get in touch with us as well.
Hi, thank you everyone for joining us. We'll be sending out a PDF of the slides for everyone, along with the resource that Jody mentioned. Thank you so much, and hope you have a great work day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.